Hi, and welcome to concept number 2. Today we're going to talk about training zones. So training zones are basically parameters that we set up, whether you're a coach or a fitness trainer or a researcher. We're looking at certain descriptions of how much work is being done and how hard or how intense is the level of work that's being done. So often you're going to see heart rate used to identify certain levels of intensity related to endurance or sustained stamina type work. And then at the same time we can look at certain external loads like power or pace while running, power on the bike. All those measurements can actually give us some indication of how hard we're working and what we need to do to get the training effect that we're looking for. So I want to describe kind of how we come up with these different zones and what you'll be using throughout this program. So it's principle-oriented zone training. Basically, we're trying to identify, again, those parameters so that for each individual, so that they can train within a certain level of intensity that's intended for the workout. You're going to find out there that there's anywhere from 3 levels or 3 zones all the way up to 7 or 8 zones. It really depends on the coach and the researcher and the fitness trainer or the program. So there's really no right or wrong way of doing that. You just have to make sure you understand what the zones mean for that particular type of training plan. They're all kind of centered, at least when we're talking about endurance-related type training zones, they're going to be centered around various levels of intensity, mostly intensity that you can sustain for a bit. So in other words, we're not really looking at a direct load where it's like lifting a load of a weight where it's a repetition. We're really looking at effort levels that you're trying to sustain either for short periods of time up here in the higher zones or for longer, easier type levels of intensity for longer periods of time. So we set that up. We're going to show you a graph here in a minute, but basically we can look at certain physiological parameters. Specifically when we're talking here, we're going to talk about certain ventilatory changes that happen at certain levels of intensity. So if I was to test somebody and we put them on what we call a ramping protocol, we'll kind of increase the workload and see how their heart rate responds to certain loads, certain power or pace load increases. And then we see how that response is associated to certain physiological changes that are happening. So, and just to give you a quick aerial view here, typically somewhere around what we call the aerobic threshold, or sometimes the ventilatory or lactate threshold 1. This is where we start to have a little bit of trouble breathing and carrying on a conversation at the same time, but you can carry out 4 or 5 words and still keep doing the work. So that's kind of a threshold that we can identify. And there's certain physiological things that are going on here in this right around threshold or a little bit above it, what we're going to call zone 2, that we can count on to get some certain adaptations. Specifically, we're looking at the ability to use fat well and save our carbohydrate stores that are limited. In zone 1, we're going to be a little bit lower on the intensity, below that aerobic threshold, pretty much easy going, just a little lift and effort, but nothing at all as far as intensity goes. It's an easy, very light type level. And usually this is used for active recovery if we're talking exercise. And then we can get up into the 3, which is kind of in between these 2 thresholds. We have the aerobic, and then now we have anaerobic threshold where it really becomes difficult to breathe. And then, so in between is zone 3, and then right around that threshold, zone 4, and then into these higher intensities in zone 5 and 6, where basically for the duration that you're performing, you're nearly going to your max effort to make it through that duration. So We can get multiple zones that reflect each of those types of effort levels. Some coaches and researchers will just use the two, below aerobic threshold, that's easy, recovery zone. In between is the moderate zone, often was referred to in the literature as the target zone, in between these two thresholds. Obviously you can do the work, but it starts to get really fatiguing if you try and go out for 2 or 3 hours. But with under an hour, most of the work in zone 2 and 3 is very tolerable. And then above that anaerobic threshold, now we're really typically doing some type of interval in order to do that kind of work. So we're talking about load. So overload is a principle within training. So we're trying to apply more stress, and we can refer to that as a load. The load creates kind of a physiological stress than one's accustomed to, and this is required for a training effect. So we have to push, we have to overstress, overreach a little bit in order to adapt and get a little bit fitter or more fit. A load that's too hard or too easy will limit that training effect. So getting into a little bit more precision will be helpful as far as how much of a load in order to get the right training effect. If we don't control those loads, sometimes that can lead to poor results and even an injury or potentially an illness from overtraining problems. So heart rates will help, or any kind of load parameter that we're looking at. If we know how it relates to our physiology, we can control our loads a little bit more effectively. When we talk volume, sometimes that's a term referred to in our training. Volume is a mixture of intensity, duration, and frequency of the workout. So our load is described as a higher volume when we increase the intensity, the relative load, with the amount of time that you're exercising, and then how many times you repeat that. So that's our volume equation. And the volume's increased if it's increased too quickly, that can lead to problems, as we mentioned a minute ago. Precision training then is kind of when we're talking about heart rate zones, it's kind of the go-to term. Basically, we're trying to get precise load measurements so that we can improve the training effect rather than work against ourselves when we're training. So we have heart rate, power, and GPS monitors. They can all monitor these loads and these intensities to help manage the loads. With endurance training, loads are often anchored by a heart rate or watts, and it's anchored at the anaerobic threshold. So in other words, how hard are you working relative to that anaerobic threshold, which we'll talk about in a minute. So if your threshold is at a certain heart rate or a wattage output for an external load, then we know kind of where hard is, the kind of hard we're going to describe, and then we can look at all of your other work around that threshold as relative to that load. So in other words, the zones make sense because we know where they are in reference to the anaerobic threshold. So zones are created to set the criteria for the workout. So recovery and regeneration. So this is another key component or effect that you have when you are able to control your loads. You can recover appropriately. And recovery is the key to supercompensation. Supercompensation means if I overload or overreach in my training, but I give myself appropriate recovery, I can not only get better at doing that same kind of load again, but may even supercompensate and be able to do more of a load. So that's one of those training compensations. Training above the zone 2 will often require more recovery time. So if you're out for longer bike rides or runs and you're pushing the intensity out of that zone 2 range, that's going to be creating a cost that may be difficult to recover from. So that's why a lot of endurance athletes are spending time in zone 2. They get really specific adaptations as far as the ability to use fat, what we call metabolic efficiency. They don't build up a whole lot of fatigue products that may require a lot of recovery time. So some of the forms of training that we recommend are here in Zone 2 to get those adaptations, but not interfere with other training throughout the week. Overtraining, late nights, poor nutrition, it can all lead to energy depletion. So anything that creates kind of a stressor to the physiology can slow down your recovery and regeneration period. And then that regeneration requires an attention to the sleep, work, stress, and travel patterns. So the appropriate training zone manipulation can help ensure that recovery that's so important. So here's that anchor point. Here's a couple of ways that we can come up with what's called the anaerobic threshold. That's kind of a generic term for these trend changes that happen in how your body responds to certain loads. So if we go through a ramping load protocol, let's say on a treadmill or bike, we're going to see some trend change in the way we breathe, the ventilatory threshold, or in our blood, how lactate accumulates. So both of these, this is the ventilatory threshold, this is a VT2, and this is where we have a couple of millimoles beyond where lactate starts to accumulate above this baseline. They're both kind of saying the same thing. We're using energy systems that are requiring certain types of processes that are going to create more fatigue products, or metabolites is what they're referred to. And this can cause an increase in ventilation and increase in lactate levels, and they give us an indication that we're now starting to get into a more dependency on these what we call anaerobic systems that create a little bit more havoc, and they're harder to sustain if we have to rely too much on those anaerobic systems. So this anaerobic threshold again is our anchor, and we want to be able to train, specifically sometimes below this anaerobic threshold for longer type or recovery type work, and then we may be doing interval work above that anaerobic threshold. If we're looking at substrates are fat versus carbohydrates and protein. Generally speaking, when you're doing sustainable exercise, we're dependent on carbohydrates and fat. And when we do metabolic testing, we can actually look at someone, again, this is the time through the test, it's a ramping protocol. So as the load goes up, let's say they're running, the speed's going up every minute, we can see how the energy requirements are going up. So these are calories per minute, this blue line. And then it'll go all the way up to the peak level and plateau somewhere up in here before we get into recovery. We know through what's called indirect telemetry, just a fancy word for estimating what your fat utilization is, how many calories of fat are you using relative to in between calories per minute and the fat calories. This is carbohydrate. So we can see where we start to get more and more dependent on carbohydrates as our fat utilization starts to drop. So this is where we see these aerobic and anaerobic thresholds. Typically anaerobic threshold is going to be using systems that require a lot of carbohydrates. Whereas if you're in your higher fat utilization level, what we call max fat oxidation right here, this is typically our zone 2. So we can spare the carbohydrates here and keep going and going, and we probably are not going to run out of fuel if we stay in our zone 2. So that's how we come up with segregating these zones. There's a methodology to it, and we are representing certain kind of physiological adaptations in each of these zones. Now obviously sometimes you go out and work out and you're working within all of these zones, and that may be an appropriate workout. So there's no suggestion that you just can't. You have to do one at a time. But sometimes you're going to try in your training plans and your focuses to emphasize certain adaptations. So you may be doing intervals that are really close to this anaerobic threshold, or you may be doing really high intensity intervals that are well above it. You may be doing, more specifically, a longer workout, but you don't want to create problems with recovery, and you want to maximize that ability to use fat get those adaptations, so you're going to keep your heart rate within this zone 2 on those particular longer walks or runs or rides. So again, this is looking at the physiology behind the zones. So just to wrap it up, there's a lot more information within here when you read through the rest of the segments, but you'll also get to you'll be able to link into a description of the types of workouts that we're looking at. So if we were going to focus, again, you could be doing a number of zones within one workout, but here we're just showing you where the emphasis is on the zone, for example, the zone 4 adaptation. So you'll be able to link into here and see some examples of the type of workouts we're looking at, kind of what those intervals might look like, and progressions into it. So that's all part of your program. Just make sure you look through there and go to the links, and you'll be able to educate yourself on what these different zone levels look like. Obviously the plans will spell them out for you if you're using a plan, but you can get an idea of what the workouts look like for the zones. Alright, so that's a little information, introduction to zone training, and good luck with this.